Hillbilly cosplay is the exact phrase Ilhan Omar smilingly directed at the Vice President of the United States on a live broadcast before an audience of 7 million viewers. The surrounding audience laughed. Within 2 minutes, the video segment accumulated 40,000 shares online. One of her assistants thrust his fist into the air in triumph. The Congresswoman truly believed this evening belonged entirely to her. She selected the incorrect target, however, as JD Vance showed absolutely no reaction. He avoided looking in her direction and refrained from speaking a single syllable. The Vice President simply opened his computer, and the data he recited over the subsequent 47 minutes, examining every line, browser tab, and figure, explains exactly why that viral insult will never appear on her social media pages. The representative had desperately desired a highly circulated internet phenomenon. She certainly received one, although it was entirely different from the outcome she had anticipated. The public forum had only been underway for 6 minutes, and Ilhan Omar was clearly dominating the exchange. She arrived fully prepared after dedicating 2 solid days to intensive strategy sessions. Her staff understood precisely which persona to project for a nationwide viewership. They avoided the legislative bureaucrat reciting statistics, opting instead for the fierce survivor who had overcome armed conflict, displacement camps, a foreign land, and an unfamiliar tongue, only to ultimately diminish the grandeur of the United States Congress. This specific version was adored by her core supporters, dreaded by her political adversaries, and magnetically attractive to the television lenses. Her introductory remarks consisted of 4 minutes of pure rhetorical intensity. She rapidly highlighted healthcare reductions, deportation sweeps, travel restrictions on Islamic nations, her displacement narrative, and her journey from Mogadishu through Kenya. The story detailed 4 years in a settlement facility before reaching America at 12 years old with absolutely zero possessions. She delivered the narrative with her usual lack of self-pity or gentle sentiment, utilizing the hardened demeanor of someone who fought for her position and challenged any listener to dispute her lived reality. She subsequently pivoted toward Vance, displaying a specific upward chin tilt that her advisors dubbed the launch angle because it always signaled impending conflict. The self-proclaimed country boy with an Ivy League education now wishes to lecture a battleground survivor about genuine hardship. That behavior does not represent true bravery, Mr. Vice President. That is merely playing a fictional character. The auditorium erupted instantly. This was not courteous clapping, but rather the intense, charged roaring of a crowd witnessing a metaphorical explosive being detonated. Within the media enclosure, 3 separate network producers grabbed their mobile devices simultaneously. Over on the social platform X, the video segment was already being edited for distribution. The phrase regarding her specific insult became a viral trending topic before the room's amusement even subsided. Observing the event on a digital tablet from the waiting area, her communications director messaged a single explosive word to their team thread. This exact scenario had been their primary strategy all along. The goal was to manufacture a highly memorable confrontation. They intended to let online networks amplify the interaction organically. The objective was to awake the next day with the footage playing across every news ticker while automated donation requests were dispatched. The Congresswoman had executed this exact maneuver on countless prior occasions. The tactic was consistently successful without fail. The event facilitator then directed the conversation toward Vance. At this precise juncture, the entire trajectory of the evening shifted. The Vice President completely refused to fall into the conversational trap. He offered zero reaction to the rural caricature comment. He likewise ignored the accusation of adopting a fake persona. He completely disregarded every single point she had articulated. He overlooked the poignant tale of her displaced youth. He bypassed the mentions of religious travel restrictions. He skipped over the grievances regarding healthcare defunding. He formulated no rebuttal because he simply had not been paying attention to her speech.
Instead, he was thoroughly engaged in reading text. His portable computer rested open on the desk before him. His visual focus remained entirely locked onto the glowing display. His hands navigated the keys with the calm accuracy of someone who had researched this encounter for far more than 48 hours. bringing forth material that her team could never have predicted, primarily because she armed herself for an ideological argument while he arrived with entirely different intentions. His sole purpose for attending was to perform mathematical accounting. 5 seconds of complete quiet filled the auditorium. Subsequently, while keeping his gaze lowered, he calmly stated his appreciation for the introduction. He announced that the rural simpleton would proceed to recite federal election financial disclosures. That single statement contained absolutely zero rage or bruised ego. The delivery was so emotionally vacant that it hardly qualified as a retort. This muted reaction succeeded brilliantly because it demonstrated to the crowd that the verbal jab had completely missed its mark, passing through him like illumination piercing a window pane without leaving any residual impact. The collective amusement in the venue transitioned away from silence and straight into deep apprehension. It was the specific unease of spectators who witness a heavy blow connect, only to observe the struck combatant grin in response. Back in the staging area, the communications manager's celebratory text message remained completely ignored on the display. That staffer was now gazing blankly at his digital monitor. Vance had deliberately utilized his computer. The derogatory remark failed utterly, and throughout 2 decades of public relations experience, the director had never witnessed a politician absorb such a theatrical televised insult only to counter with dry campaign finance reports. The legislative campaign organization backing the Congresswoman disclosed nearly $3 million in expenditures directed toward a business named the E Street Group during a 2-year span. This specific enterprise operates as a strategic advisory agency headquartered in the nation's capital. The primary proprietor of the business is Tim Minette. The vice president paused momentarily to let that identity resonate. Tim Minette happens to be the spouse of the Congresswoman. The representative entered into matrimony with him during that election year. Those massive financial transfers occurred precisely while their romantic involvement initiated and persisted well into their wedded union. Nearly $3 million of contributor funds were funneled into a corporation controlled by the individual she courted and ultimately wed. He expressed a desire to be exceedingly accurate regarding the implications of these facts. Supporters who trusted the politician and contributed small denominations under the assumption of financing a grassroots revolution actually enriched a business governed by her romantic partner. He then offered to share the background of one specific financial backer. This particular contributor is named Amamira Nouri. She resides in a specific neighborhood known colloquially as Little Mogadishu within the legislative boundary of the Congresswoman. Her occupation involves preparing ingredients at an ethnic dining establishment located along Riverside Avenue. Her annual income totals $26,000. Since the midterm election cycle, she has systematically contributed $50 monthly to this political fund. This sustained effort amounts to $3,600 across a 6-year time frame. According to her own statements in a local publication, she provides these funds because she views the politician as a genuine peer. Donating that sum on such a meager annual wage is highly significant. Such financial commitment represents profound personal deprivation. This working citizen actively forgoes basic necessities to empower her elected official to advocate for their demographic. Consequently, those specific funds alongside the contributions of countless similar working-class supporters flowed directly to the consulting agency operated by her spouse. The Congresswoman aggressively tilted forward into her audio equipment. She declared that transferring political funds to strategic advisors remains an entirely normal industry convention. Vance retorted that the normal operating procedures for American electoral races do not generally involve wedding the contracted strategist. He delivered exactly 8 impactful words. The vice president maintained his visual lock on his computer screen the entire time. Those syllables struck the room like a blade impaling a wooden block, sticking vertically while shuddering, demanding absolute attention and remaining irremovable without direct confrontation. The representative parted her lips but quickly shut them again. Her defensive strategies were tailored to repel assaults regarding her national loyalty, Islamic faith, foreign birth, and diplomatic stances concerning the Middle East, She neglected to study federal election documents because accounting records are inherently dull and tedious subjects rarely surface during high-energy public forums. Yet on this particular evening, mundane bureaucracy served as an armament, effortlessly penetrating her rhetorical shields because her armor was forged to deflect entirely different ideological hostilities. The Republican leader clicked into another browser window. This digital navigation developed into a methodical tempo, with each web page representing a new gateway. With every stroke of the trackpad, the working-class donations drifted further from their origin and approached the murky destination where massive campaign expenditures transform into household wealth. The second digital document revealed a Virginian vineyard jointly possessed by the consultant's spouse. 4 years prior, a civilian financier residing in the capital supplied him with $300,000 to bankroll this agricultural venture. The political strategist guaranteed an immense dual-fold profit margin. Those promised financial yields failed to ever materialize. Following a legal complaint initiated by the backer, the consultant agreed to an out-of-court resolution. The vice president emphasized his desire to clarify the chronological sequence of these events. Grassroots contributors funneled millions into the advisory company managed by her partner. He subsequently leveraged his elevated status to lure external venture capital into his alcohol production business. One specific backer provided significant capital while anticipating a massive percentage yield. The entirety of those investment funds seemingly vanished. The aggrieved party was forced into litigation just to recover the principal amount. That specific vineyard operation has permanently ceased functioning. He then clicked to reveal another web document. The third screen displayed the investment management agency established by the spouse. The digital storefront for this enterprise asserts control over $60 billion in holding portfolios. He halted his speech deliberately to allow that massive figure to permeate the auditorium. $60 billion is an astronomical sum. Managing such immense wealth would instantly position this company among the elite financial institutions nationwide, eclipsing prominent traditional banking conglomerates. Yet this supposed financial titan lacks any official credentialing with the federal regulatory authorities. The official corporate headquarters maps directly to a temporary shared office facility. The online domain features 0 staff directories, lacks an investment history, and contains absolutely no verifiable public documentation of prior monetary allocations. This agency boasts billions in unverified capital from a rented cubicle without governmental oversight, while the proprietor remains wedded to an active federal legislator who documented these phantom assets on official transparency ledgers. Vance finally shifted his eyes toward the broadcasting equipment, bypassing the congresswoman entirely to pierce the millions of households watching remotely. When the working-class restaurant employee contributes a portion of her paycheck, she genuinely believes she is financing a righteous crusade for her neighborhood. Upon reaching the designated political agency, those grassroots dollars underwrite a lucrative strategic enterprise. As that enterprise channels capital into a vineyard, the agricultural business ends up deceiving an external financier. Following the collapse of the alcohol business, a phantom holding company materializes to project immense wealth from a transient workspace. The architect orchestrating this entire labyrinth of enterprises is legally bound in marriage to the politician soliciting funds from low-income supporters. There were exactly 6 layers of corporate obfuscation. The working woman's hard-earned cash traveled through a half-dozen structural barriers. Behind the final threshold sat nothing more than a temporary workstation leased on a fractional basis. The vice president's vocal intonation abruptly shifted. His monotonous Midwestern drawl softened into a hushed resonance reserved for transitioning from conceptual statistics into deeply intimate realities, signaling the moment digital data became legally binding sworn testimonies. He announced his intention to discuss 3 specific mathematical figures. The visual monitor illuminated a trio of official governmental wealth declarations positioned adjacently. These documents represented identical mandatory fields submitted across successive annual cycles containing wildly contradictory responses. The transparency report from the previous year indicated the spouse possessed cumulative corporate holdings amounting to slightly over $50,000. Those initial evaluations encompassing the advisory agency and the fractional Vineyard stake hovered around that modest five-figure valuation. The subsequent transparency ledgers submitted during the spring of the following year offered a drastically altered perspective. Addressing the exact same prompt regarding commercial properties, the estimated value inexplicably skyrocketed to a range spanning $6 to $30 million. The formerly struggling vineyard suddenly appeared valued between $1 and $5 million. Furthermore, the phantom holding agency operating from the rented desk carried an unbelievable valuation cresting at $25 million. However, a revised document submitted earlier this very year presented yet another narrative. In response to that identical valuation inquiry, the cumulative business worth plummeted back down to a maximum of $95,000. The supposedly massive venture capital entity was entirely erased from the ledger. 3 separate legal documents were filed. The vineyard's valuation was identically reduced to absolute zero. The visual aid clearly broadcasted all 3 contradictory records simultaneously. The initial claim stated $51,000. The subsequent peak valuation hit an astonishing $30 million. The final correction settled below $100,000. The politician provided a trio of wildly incompatible responses to a standardized governmental inquiry while swearing to their absolute veracity under penalty of perjury. The Congresswoman attempted to classify this massive discrepancy as a simple bookkeeping mistake, brushing off an irregularity approaching $30 million on a legally binding affidavit. The narrative then circled back to the working-class restaurant employee for a second thematic application. The vice president executed the calculations using his signature method of converting unfathomable statistics into relatable human suffering. He reiterated that the marginalized supporter earns merely $26,000 annually. The numerical gap between the inflated disclosure and the final revision roughly equates to over a millennium of that specific voter's gross income. Over 11 centuries of strenuous manual labor would be required to match that single discrepancy. A deviation of that magnitude transcends basic arithmetic mistakes. It represents a fundamentally dishonest fabrication provided to a straightforward legal prompt. Furthermore, that specific inquiry carried the heavy burden of legal swearing. The Congresswoman swiftly grasped her hydration glass. The movement was aggressively rapid, indicating a desperate need to occupy her hands rather than leaving them exposed on the desk for a massive television audience to witness her rising panic. Her legal counsel, positioned directly to her rear, shifted inward to murmur advice. The representative responded with a subtle cranial rotation. This diminutive gesture remained undetected by the live audience but was perfectly captured by the broadcast lenses. It was the specific physical reaction of a defendant instructed to cease speaking who simultaneously recognizes she has maintained complete silence for quite some time. She had failed to utter a single word for 4 agonizing minutes. Such profound muteness from a politician renowned for her ceaseless vocal advocacy echoed more forcefully than her most passionate speeches. The Congresswoman eventually launched a counteroffensive. She retaliated instinctively because individuals shaped by extreme displacement learn to combat all threats. Survivors of such trauma refuse to remain docile while an opponent publicly dissects their familial affairs before a hostile national populace. She mobilized every ounce of rhetorical capital she had amassed during her congressional tenure. She leveraged her biography, her intersectional traits, and the ethical supremacy of someone who endured horrors that the conservative interrogator could never fathom. She angrily proclaimed that the vice president preferred discussing her spouse's professional ventures. She accused him of dodging conversations regarding juveniles being forcibly separated from their guardians at international checkpoints. She criticized his silence concerning religious immigration embargoes that fractured countless neighborhoods. She lambasted his avoidance of the aggressive deportation sweeps that horrified long-term residents within her jurisdiction. She insisted his fixation on advisory invoices merely reflected the pathetic playbook of the current executive branch. She argued his faction fundamentally fails at ideological governance. Consequently, she claimed they resort to weaponizing bureaucratic investigations against their most vocal detractors. Her vocal cords strained momentarily, fueled entirely by intense anger rather than vulnerability. It was the authentic rage of a survivor who wholly internalized her displacement narrative, conquered devastating geopolitical obstacles, achieved immense political power, and rigidly determined that any financial scrutiny actually represented a sinister assault on her basic citizenship. The audience within the chamber began to physically react. Her numerous loyalists in the seating area commenced applauding. The volume of the ovations steadily increased. Briefly, she reclaimed dominance over the auditorium, leveraging her practiced ability to saturate a space with the compelling resonance of a triumphant survivor demanding absolute submission from her listeners. The vice president simply bided his time. He exhibited the same profound stoicism he demonstrated during previous adversarial debates, projecting the calm certainty of a seasoned strategist who understands that emotional outbursts inevitably exhaust themselves. Following the commotion, he articulated softly while maintaining his visual focus on his digital screen. He explicitly clarified that he had completely avoided referencing the Congresswoman's theological beliefs. He stated that he had deliberately ignored her naturalization history. He noted his complete silence regarding international travel policies or territorial boundary enforcement. He affirmed that his commentary focused strictly upon federal election records, monetary transparency reports, and a rented office location. He emphasized that these materials constitute official governmental records. The pages are literally covered in mathematical data. Those specific digits represent an unalterable, objective reality. The politician is completely insulated from retaliatory investigations based on her ideological combativeness. Scrutiny surrounds her solely because nearly $3 million were suspiciously funneled into her spouse's enterprise. Her marital partner's Vineyard actively deceived a financial backer. Furthermore, his holding agency fabricated a massive $60 billion portfolio from a temporary cubicle, while her own sworn asset declarations fluctuated by nearly $30 million. Presenting these documented facts does not constitute an assault on a displaced person. That is merely basic mathematics. The invocation of basic math served as a definitive conclusion to an exhaustingly complex dispute. It aggressively shut the rhetorical pathway the Congresswoman attempted to navigate, severing the conversational bridge connecting factual ledgers to personal grievance and tying monetary scandals to geopolitical controversies. The conservative leader obstinately declined to engage with those deflective tactics. He remained firmly entrenched within the realm of verifiable financial statistics. Within that specific numerical domain, intersecting victimhood narratives and cheering supporters proved utterly powerless to somehow legitimize an unexplained multi-million-dollar accounting anomaly. The vice president finally shut his portable computer. The glowing monitor extinguished itself for the initial instance in nearly an hour. He directed his gaze squarely upon the representative, entirely bypassing the broadcasting lenses and the assembled crowd. This marked merely the second occasion he had directly acknowledged her visual presence during the entire event. The initial instance occurred directly after she hurled her theatrical rural insult at him. His earlier glance was fleeting and vacant, characterizing someone who detects an auditory stimulus but purposefully declines to engage. This current ocular engagement carried a profoundly different intensity. His unblinking stare remained fiercely locked onto his opponent. He calmly noted that his counterpart initiated the evening by labeling him a fraudulent country bumpkin. He expressed absolute indifference toward the derogatory label. He quipped that superior individuals have directed far worse insults at him in the past. He recalled his grandmother, who acted as his guardian during his mother's addiction treatments, advising him that critics mock your appearance exclusively when they remain incapable of criticizing your actual performance. This represented his initial acknowledgement of her disparaging comment nearly an hour after its delivery. The vast temporal gap separating the attack from his retaliation, saturated with campaign finance violations and agricultural deceit, fundamentally transformed the nature of her original slight. At the moment the Congresswoman deployed the phrase, it functioned as a pointed offensive strike. Following an exhaustive mathematical dissection, however, the massive viewership clearly recognized that the politician hurled the pejorative merely to divert attention away from her catastrophic financial ledgers. He reiterated the monthly contribution habits of the impoverished restaurant worker. The donor actively sacrifices essential luxuries. She regularly endures exhausting consecutive labor shifts. She surrenders her capital entirely out of ideological devotion. He declared that this specific constituent holds a fundamental right to hear the Congresswoman explain exactly how her donations navigated numerous corporate barriers to land on a rented office desk rather than aiding her neighborhood. The politician explicitly branded him a theatrical fraud earlier in the broadcast. He invited the nation to determine which of them was truly masquerading, the official analyzing legal documents or the elected leader funneling grassroots wealth into an unregistered shadow corporation operating from a shared workspace. The vice president withheld any further commentary. He secured his computer with his customary precision, aligning the boundaries and positioning his writing instrument in a manner reflecting a professional auditor finalizing a devastating evaluation. The representative offered absolutely zero rebuttal. Her silence was definitely not derived from a lack of potential retorts. While normally highly vocal, she remained quiet because the foundational reality of the venue had completely collapsed, exposing her carefully constructed evening as hollow theatrical artifice built entirely upon a single derogatory quip. Her verbal jab maintained its effectiveness for barely 120 seconds. Conversely, the relentless data deployment proved victorious over a 47-minute span. Within the merciless arithmetic of broadcast media, a sustained factual demolition easily vanquishes a brief viral moment. The defeated Congresswoman exited the venue through a discreet lateral door. This evasion was hardly motivated by a sudden terror of journalistic scrutiny. While historically fearless before reporters, she fled simply because her legal counsel aggressively demanded an immediate retreat. When a lawyer mandates a covert departure following a public inquiry, it universally signifies a catastrophic deviation from the anticipated strategic narrative. Her principal media strategist stood stationed near her transport vehicle. The staffer had composed a trio of distinct press releases throughout the broadcast to accommodate various projected outcomes. The celebratory option proclaimed that the representative successfully unmasked the conservative leader's profound double standards. The moderate alternative simply stated that the politician engaged in a constructive legislative discussion. The final combative draft promised fierce retaliation against the opponent's highly partisan aggressions. Absolutely zero of these prepared documents mentioned the controversial consulting agency. The pre-written statements entirely ignored the multi-million-dollar financial transfer. Furthermore, they completely neglected the rented corporate headquarters, the deceptive agricultural scheme, and the massive sworn transparency discrepancy. Her advisory squad had armed themselves strictly for ideological warfare. However, the vice president deployed merciless arithmetic, and her strategists lacked any drafted contingency for forensic bookkeeping. Trapped inside the vehicle, the Congresswoman remained completely silent. Her mobile device rested inverted upon the upholstery directly adjacent to her hip. The smartphone shuddered violently, exhibiting the specific mechanical spasms of hardware overwhelmed by an unprecedented deluge of incoming digital alerts. She refused to retrieve the trembling communication tool. She fully comprehended the digital fallout after witnessing her highly shareable, carefully manufactured slight get effortlessly annihilated by a tidal wave of indisputable financial data that washed away her defenses with cold precision. The ensuing aftermath unfolded in a highly predictable sequence. Anyone harboring the delusion that her viral barb achieved victory must review the subsequent events. During the initial quarter of the day, the Congresswoman unequivocally controlled the narrative. Her theatrical rural insults saturated every corner of the cultural zeitgeist. Major news broadcasters, digital timelines, and private message threads echoed the phrase endlessly. The edited video sequence proved flawlessly concise, piercing, and rhetorically destructive. Campaign donations experienced an immediate and massive surge. Social media interactions directly tagging her accounts multiplied exponentially. Her communications staff hurriedly composed celebratory digital blasts for their mailing list. Online consensus unilaterally declared a flawless ideological triumph for the progressive legislator. Suddenly, a subsequent video segment entered the digital ecosystem. This secondary footage completely bypassed the initial viral confrontation. It featured the conservative official casually declaring that standard electoral procedures exclude wedding one's strategic advisor while staring blankly at his monitor. The utterance contained merely 8 syllables of brutal honesty. Lasting under a minute, the recording lacked histrionics or shouting, instead capturing a bureaucratic recitation that successfully silenced a highly vocal politician. By sunrise, the media file amassed 11 million unique views. A third digital recording surfaced shortly thereafter. This specific upload detailed the convoluted corporate journey of a meager grassroots donation landing on a rented desk. This forensic breakdown rapidly garnered 14 million visual engagements. The financial analysis penetrated digital communities immune to partisan bickering, captivating accounting message boards, grassroots integrity coalitions, and charitable watchdog organizations. Demographics completely apathetic toward political theater were deeply disturbed by immense sums of campaign cash funneling into a marital partner's business. A fourth video eventually illuminated the trio of contradictory sworn transparency ledgers. The staggering valuations fluctuated wildly across the 3 respective declarations. This visual evidence accumulated an additional 9 million engagements. The presentation required 0 editorial narration to deliver its impact. A trifecta of official figures across separate government documents conveyed the entire damning narrative. The underlying conclusion unequivocally indicated that at least one submitted valuation constituted deliberate perjury. Furthermore, reasonable suspicion suggested every single figure was completely fabricated. Before 3 days elapsed, the cumulative viewership of these investigative segments surpassed 34 million interactions. The most devastating paradox, which her advisors helplessly recognized, was that her initial viral jab functioned merely as a massive gateway mechanism. Viewers initially engaged with the theatrical insult purely for its comedic value. However, the audience remained captivated by the campaign finance records because the underlying scandal proved undeniably catastrophic. The Congresswoman had actively cultivated the very viewership that would ultimately witness her political annihilation. By beaming a manufactured controversy into millions of homes within the first 2 minutes, she gifted her opponent a colossal platform entirely devoid of cost. During the initial 7 days following the debate, the fallout continued escalating. The Progressive Representatives' administrative team published a defense classifying the confrontation as a racially and religiously driven character assassination. Crucially, this official release ignored the controversial consulting group, bypassed the multi-million-dollar transfers, neglected the Phantom Winery, omitted the holding company, disregarded the temporary workspace, and completely avoided the massive asset contradiction. The defense leaned entirely upon intersectional grievances, yet that historically invulnerable armor proved useless when the topic had irrevocably shifted. The prevailing discourse now centered strictly upon basic mathematics, a discipline wholly devoid of racial or religious categorizations. Federal election regulators subsequently launched an official probe regarding the monetary transfers directed to her husband's firm. This initial maneuver represented a preliminary inquiry rather than a full investigation, functioning as the governmental equivalent of expressing mild suspicion. However, announcing such a regulatory probe immediately after tens of millions witnessed the scandalous financial allocations dissected on national television transcends mere administrative trivia. It transforms into a massive front-page scandal that dominated news cycles globally. By the commencement of the second week, demographic fracturing became apparent. The localized East African immigrant population residing within the Twin Cities finally broke their silence. Their collective response was naturally somewhat fractured rather than a monolith. Large societal groups inherently resist adopting singular, unified perspectives. Nevertheless, a palpable undercurrent of disillusionment swept through her stronghold neighborhood that had never previously existed. This sentiment resembled profound communal humiliation rather than outright fury, stemming from loyalists discovering on national television that their meager grassroots contributions had enriched her marital partner's corporate accounts rather than aiding their struggling demographic. A regional ethnic broadcaster verbalized a critical inquiry that previously remained strictly taboo among her constituents. He reminded his listeners that the community had uniformly shielded the politician from countless external controversies. He then genuinely questioned if the Congresswoman assumed her base would indefinitely ignore immense financial irregularities without demanding accountability. This broadcast constituted a massive structural fracture in the localized political fortress she enjoyed for years. Once such fissures manifest within supposedly impregnable boundaries, the resulting damage typically outpaces any defensive containment efforts. The political landscape deteriorated further during the third week. Her immediate electoral rival released a brief 15-second promotional broadcast. The audio track prominently featured the recognizable vocal tones of the working-class restaurant donor. The constituent recounted submitting steady monetary increments out of deep demographic solidarity. A visual graphic demanded accountability while highlighting the immense capital transferred to the spouse's enterprise. The advertisement concluded by asserting the electorate possesses a fundamental right to transparency. This targeted media campaign aired across native-tongue frequencies directly within the very neighborhood the exploited donor inhabited. The message penetrated a deeply loyal demographic the incumbent politician arrogantly believed would remain permanently subservient. Subsequent voter surveys indicated the Congresswoman hovered below 50%, with her challenger advancing rapidly alongside a massive undecided bloc. Dropping beneath an outright majority represented an unprecedented statistical low for the incumbent within her own jurisdiction. A previous adversary managed to approach within a mere 2 percentage points during a prior election cycle. However, this current challenger achieved terrifying proximity despite operating with inferior financial resources and lower initial public visibility. Furthermore, the determining electoral contest loomed merely a month and a half in the future. The incumbent's advisory committee was acutely aware of these disastrous metrics. They deliberately suppressed the polling data from public distribution. Yet, when the statistics inevitably surfaced just hours later, since failing to secure a majority in such a heavily partisan stronghold always breaches confidentiality, the media refused to frame the situation as a comfortable lead. Instead, global publications declared the progressive titan dangerously vulnerable in her long-held territory, purely because an opposing conservative methodically articulated basic chronological accounting. The representative explicitly attempted to brand her rival as a theatrical fraud. The vice president retaliated by completely exposing her massive rhetorical deception. Consequently, the observing public, specifically the grassroots immigrants and the localized neighborhood loyalists, experienced a profound awakening. The unwavering followers who demonstrated blind faith for nearly a decade finally began voicing the singular most devastating inquiry. They demanded to trace the capital through 6 corporate layers to a rented cubicle, devastating a politician who desperately regretted her initial viral insult. Had she avoided deploying that specific derogatory phrase, the ensuing 47 minutes of forensic destruction would have remained entirely unwatched. That subsequent time frame contained the irrefutable, undeniable statistical evidence. Those problematic calculations continue to exist in the public record. The underlying arithmetic will perpetually haunt her political legacy. Numbers do not care what you call them. Numbers do not care what you call the man who reads them.